We're starting the recording, so you need to go whenever you want. Right. So
when we don't get anyone through the door in 30 seconds, then I'll start.
Okay.
No, I just want to let that.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our final plenary of the Congress. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Joep Leerssen, who is one of the most distinguished cultural historians and comparativists in Europe, to give this plenary, and has suffered greatly, as many of us have, in terms of getting out his transit on the relatively simple flight from Amsterdam to Prague, both here and it seems also back. So it's really good to have such a good audience to greet him today. I've known him for 31 years since we first met, which is about the length of time that he's been Professor of European Studies at Amsterdam. He's also a Royal Netherlands Academy Research Professor, a winner of the Spinoza Prize on the Dutch Research Council. He was for almost a decade head of the National Institute for Cultural History in the Netherlands. He has an honorary doctorate from the University of Bucharest. He's had a whole slew of visiting appointments, which perhaps the Erasmus Professorship at Harvard is the most distinguished, so there are plenty of competitors to that. He started his career as an Irish historian and comparativist, and to that extent, I don't think there's been a real move away from that in any decisive form. But one of the things that has occurred in the last 20 years is that more and more his scholarship has become foundational for understanding the development of modern European nationalism, and particularly the interface between inherited imaginaries and ethnic typologies and stereotypes, and the institutionalization of those by 19th century national practices. I'm not going to recommend one or other of his many books, which started publication Mere Irish in 1986, because they're all terrific. But what I would draw attention to is a book that he officially edited, but in fact mostly wrote a large part of, which is the Encyclopedia of Romantic Nationalism in Europe, 2 volumes, Amsterdam University Press 2018, an absolute comprehensive masterpiece of every possible way of understanding the issue in almost every possible country inside and outside the European Union in this continent. Terrific piece of work, and now going into a second edition. I'm interested in everything that Joep does, and particularly I'm looking forward to hearing more about the National Identity as Spectacle project. But today, he's going to be talking to us about Scotland as a literary multiverse, and he wants me to let you know that he's channeling his inner and outer Anne Rigney, who of course gave a plenary at the First World Congress in 2014, and is herself a tremendously important scholar and has been so important to scholarship and cultural memory and to, you would like to say, his own career and its great success. So without further ado, Joep Leerssen.
Okay. Thank you very much, Murray. Can you all hear me? That was a characteristically generous introduction. I hope I can live up to it. I doubt it. I have to apologize to all of you for being a fleeting presence. I hate seeing people do keynotes at conferences that they don't really participate in, and I'd really been looking forward to joining in the sessions and talk about the future of Boslit and hearing all the papers and enriching my familiarity with this important topic. but there were multiple airport meltdowns yesterday. I left at 10 in the morning and I arrived at 2 in the morning this morning to find that my return flight this Sunday has been cancelled as well. So I was up until 5 in the morning trying to find alternative, and the only one is I have to leave tomorrow morning at 8. So, you know, I'm only here today and I bitterly regret that. And I would resent myself if I were, you know, so apologies for that. I hope to make the most of the day and I'll try not to collapse over dinner because that we should have fun to. Anyway, so Scotland as a literary multiverse. The title really grew out of my long, happy friendship and collegiality and productive and creative differences of opinion with Murray about how important Scotland is to understand Romanticism. And I always said, no, Ireland is much more important. And I realized maybe Murray is right. So now that my daughter has moved to Glasgow and I, have crossed. And then I tried to make sense of Scotland, and I came to that rather belatedly, something that Murray has been doing all his life. I realized, as you saw in the abstract to the paper, Scotland ticks so many boxes when it comes to interesting things that I call the poetics of exception, where you're just not the mainstream, but things are being done slightly differently there. There's a slight edge to, what otherwise would be the plain vanilla flavor of culture in Europe. And it goes all the way from Ossian to Trainspotting. And even, the fact that Sean Connery played James Bond as a sort of, symbolic successor to John Buchan. And how can you bring that all that together? So this is where Bill Gates and the notion of the multiverse and, the idea that alternate realities coexist was a bit of a handle. And I've tried to sort it out. And I hope I can do an initial mapping and draw the lines from Ossian to the angel's chair and see if there is something that we can see as a pattern. And I want to start with the totally trite and totally obviously commonplace and stereotypical, because that is how Scotland's encounter with the rest of the world starts. In our childhood reading, what do we know as the bare bones of, tourist brochure, pop culture Scotland? One of the first things I learned as a young kid was that Scottish men wear skirts. And coming from a heteronormative, middle-class white Dutch background in the early 60s, men wearing skirts was usually something like Charlie's aunt or, Dame Edna Abbott. But these guys in their skirts were ultra masculine. They had macho swagger. There was nothing effeminate about wearing a skirt. So there was a clash of frames right there. And so Tintin and then a very famous Dutch kids comic strip, Frankie and Louise, where Frankie and Louise end up in the Knockham Dead mansion in Scotland, where they have to intervene in a feud between the Black Hand clan and the Clean Foot clan, and all the trappings are there. Show you that stereotypes could be a matter of fun. There is nothing denigrating or exoticist about it. And a famous Dutch kids song does, in fact, a lovely postmodern ironic mashup of all the stereotypes brought together, and all the kids can sing happily. And it's recognizable, but it's not serious. At nightfall, the Loch Ness monster plays his bagpipes, toot, 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 performing haunting melodies in an elegant tartan suit. He said, "This is the moment I look forward to all day, when I pick up my bagpipes and I can play, play, play." And then you get this sort of swirling pibroch sort of accompaniment to it. This is how it starts. So in these trite and humorous, jokey stereotypes is where the Scottish interface with people like me in the rest of the world begins in childhood in our early reading. Can I click on? Sorry. Yeah. Okay. And as you grow up and you go into adult pop culture, you begin to see the intertext. You see the stuff that Tintin and Frankie and Louise and the song, invoke and intertextually channel when they do their juvenile stuff. So obviously, Rob Roy, not just the Walter Scott, but then the Disneyfied Rob Roy, and the 39 Steps, the Hitchcock 39 Steps, not even the John Buchan 39 Steps, are behind the adventures of Tintin. And you begin to see something like an intertext. And this is what imagology does, the study of ethnotypes. You don't try to hold up the image to reality because that's stupid anyway. You know, what is the truth value of a stereotype? It's not even wrong. You know, you don't talk about the truth value. So, but what you try to do is, where does the plausibility, the recognizability come from? What intertextual recognition factors have been established? Now, you begin to explore a little bit and you become a little more literate in Scottish stuff. And then you come to, you know, the slightly more recondite things as you approach the present and adulthood, and you begin to see certain patterns. And you see that a lot of the stereotypes can be schematized in a spectrum, in a bandwidth that moves from wildness to modernity. And that somehow these two, this contrast is seen as a typical Scottish thing. And I think that the central piece there is what I would like to single out. So beside the, you know, the faux Highland Bridge that is in the 39 Steps, as you know, how here was flying across the Highlands in a large, you know, hunting game. There's also the Forth Railway Bridge. So these two bridges somehow Hitchcock's Scotland, a very traditional pre-modern one, and an ultra-modern engineering, you know, Victorian imperial way of doing modernity, and even an urban, edgy post-modernity where people are hunted not across the Highlands, but in drug deals and mindless violence across the slums and the mean streets of the big cities in train spotting. And I find it interesting that, you know, the book and the movie could have been called anything, but it's Waverley Station and train spotting and the railroads that even give that intertext to drug addicts in modern life. And in the middle there, linking these two aspects, I think one of the iconic landmarks for me in Glasgow is the Stuart Memorial Fountain, which was erected to celebrate the bringing of clean water from Loch Katrine to Glasgow in one of the great sanitation modernization projects of the 19th century, which was going on all over Europe. We have a similar, not a fountain, but a statue for the man who brought clean water to the city of Vienna. You know, after the cholera, we had to do something about our water supply. And the link between the metropolis and the surrounding countryside where the water is still clean was constructed by great engineers of the 19th century. And it's also celebrated in James Joyce's Ulysses. Leopold Bloom reaches his apotheosis as the modern everyman when he makes a cup of cocoa for Stephen Daedalus at home late at night. He opens his tap, and then Joyce zooms out and says the water streamed from the Pulafuca Reservoir up in the hill, up in the Wicklow Mountains through the 5¼ inch piping that was constructed. And all the Victorian waterworks of the 19th century city of Dublin conspire to bring water from the Wicklow Mountains to the cup of cocoa that Leopold Bloom is making for Stephen Daedalus. And that is somehow also implicit in the fountain in Kelvin Grove Park in Glasgow, which celebrates the engineers who did it, but also the Walter Scott figures around Loch Katrine and the budding Scottish tourism idea and a, you know, commodification of the Scottish countryside as a, you know, an escape from urban modernity and a tourist destination. So wildness and modernity come together, I think, very beautiful in that particular building or landmark. And so once the imagologist has done his work and picked up the diffuse cloud of little buzzing stereotypes here and there, you begin to try and sort of, you know, order it a little bit. You come up with a sort of a checklist of Scottish peculiarities. And again, I want you to give you something totally anecdotal, like the monster of the Loch Ness monster, that I picked up on that fantastic day when I helped my daughter install herself as a student at Glasgow University. And she took me to a pub, and it was late in the evening. And she said, "This is a nice pub, Hollywood theme." That's where we went. Outside the pub was a young woman on her mobile phone, petite, but clear-spoken, and I have to apologize for imitating a Scottish accent now. And I heard her say on the phone, "I'm not angry, I'm fucking raging." And somehow, you know, that summed up something very Scottish to me. So the brawn, the swagger, if you like, but also the incredible high articulateness, the verbal prowess, the command of rhetorically using all the bones, sinews, and muscles of the English language, even though you do it in an accent, a pattern of speech that is not standard, not received pronunciation. But we have all the speeches in Train Spotting and in the Walter Scott characters, where you have all these, demotic figures who have a command of English and a use of rhetoric that is second to none. So here is something that I thought was interesting. We wouldn't have that in English literature proper, where the rustics, the menials, the servants, the people in the street would not only drop their H's, but they would also be a bit tongue-tied. Think of the character of Sam in The Lord of the Rings. They have no command of English, and that signals their lack of education. Not so in Scotland. Okay, so a couple of other ones that I'd like to name check with you. There's a strongly marked local color diverging strongly from the plain vanilla default. This is the men in skirts I already talked about. But there is a native elite autonomously exercising social cultural patronage over vernacular culture. And this, I think, crucially, is where the stereotyped exotic image of Scotland is no longer colonial or Orientalist. People in Scotland, and this is embedded in the image we have of Scotland, have access to the means of self-representation. And if we think of, Said's motto to Orientalism, which he takes from Marx's 18th Brumaire, remember the motto, they must be represented, they cannot represent themselves. The inability to represent yourselves and to be represented by others looking at you is for Said the essence of Orientalism and of the hegemony involved in the exotic onlooker, framing the object of representation. In Scotland, we see Scottish actors are subjects of self-representation. And that is where Scotland is not in the subaltern position of hegemonic Orientalism and exoticism that Said talks about. And there are native cultural institutions and also a native historiography, a native sense of history. Walter Scott was nothing if not a member of the Scottish judiciary and a historian. So, there was that autonomy, and they were not in a colonial position in that respect. And they were also in the active participants in, rather than passively subjected to, imperial modernity. And there perhaps is also a difference with Ireland. So to fill in the details of how I'm schematizing this, if you like, this profile of Scottish peculiarities, how they strike an imagologist and a comparatist. The Highland lifestyle and pastimes of men in skirts, the rebellious clans, the cattle reavers, the Black Hand clan versus the Clean Foot clan, if you like, I'll be coming back to this notion of violence in the image of Scotland and lawlessness, if you like. The fact that polite society in the cities has, for a very long time, longer than elsewhere in Europe, patronized traditional demotic forms of dance and music, and the Burns effect, so that the rustic poet writing in the demotic dialect can become an actual national poet, also accepted by the native elite. The fact that Scotland has its own universities, its church, its legal system, and that it has participated in imperial modernity through its regiments and through its engineering. So all this is something that begins to, schematize or order or rubricate the various stereotypes that we encounter in the world about Scotland. Now, these cultural specificities have been instrumentalized in the course of the 19th century and the early 20th century in order to give a basis for a sense of identity, of national identity, which in 19th and 20th century politics, with the notion of popular sovereignty, with the rise of the idea of the nation state, becomes more important in political life than it had been before Napoleon. And you see that in many countries in Europe, both in existing old states like Portugal and the Netherlands and Denmark, and also emerging new cultural communities striving for autonomy, like Bohemia, like Flanders, like Ireland. Culture is no longer the self-evident embellishment of social life, but becomes symbolically important in order to assert the fact that you are different from the rest, that you are distinct and distinctive, that you have an authenticity and a standalone place in the palette of European cultural communities. And from this will be derived the Wilsonian principle of a right to self-determination. There is no new nation state after the 1918 peace treaties that gets its sovereignty without, in the previous century, having asserted its cultural independence and authenticity, and the fact that they don't speak a dialect but a separate language. So this is where I'm becoming interested as a historian in how these stereotypes or self-images or these emic sense of we are not like everybody else can play into a collective social and even political consciousness raising. This is something, and I have to do a little bit of theory with you now, which I call the cultivation of culture. Culture is just an anthropological given. It means that men button their jackets left over right, and women button their jackets right over left. Some people eat with knives and forks, others eat with chopsticks. It's how you can do things differently. It's how you shape your life. And everyone has culture, and nobody owns it. But at some point, this culture becomes an object of contemplation, an active focus of attention, and people begin to cultivate culture. It's sort of iterative feedback loop that you do culture deliberately. I take that iterative notion a little bit from Karl Mannheim, who made the fantastic observation in his Habilitationsschrift on conservatism, that in the Napoleonic period, everybody was, without even being aware of it, traditionalist. But as traditions were being challenged by modernity and upheaval, people say, oh, you know, it's not self-evident. We do not want to lose these traditions. And they become self-conscious traditionalists, and that is how they become conservatives. And so their Napoleonic modernity triggers the rise of conservatism. And so too, Napoleonic technocratic notions of the state trigger a sense, hey, we have something different that we want to have an opt-out clause, and we take exception to the one-size-fits-all notion of how you do the state. Our culture makes us different. And there is a poetics of taking exception, and people start to cultivate their culture in order to work out what it is that makes them different and to make sure that they don't lose it. I'm not going to spend too much time to take you through the entire program. It's out there on the web, and you can look it up. Basically, if you want to schematize lots of different diffuse stuff, a matrix is always a good thing, you know, rows and columns, spreadsheets, we live by them nowadays. So I rubricated culture purely heuristically by field of expression, beginning with language and then looking at discourse, material culture and immaterial culture. And I looked at 3 degrees of cultivation. One is just a salvage instinct, people finding old manuscripts that might be lost soon and deciding to print them, the way Bishop Percy prints the Percy manuscript, and the way, you know, people in the Romantic period do a lot of text editions, and people like Scott found the Roxburgh Club and the Percy Society, and you know, it's a salvage. And likewise, old forms of language and speech are being noted down, recorded. Folk tales, folk songs are being noted down and recorded, because the usual romantic trait is always, we're witnessing the last of the race. We talked about the lay of the last minstrel this morning. Why the last, right? I have something by Byron to say about that. Fiona Stafford has done a fantastic book on the idea of lastness, the last of the Mohicans, you know, the last days of Pompeii. Romanticism is very much aware of the perishability of things, the extinction of the dodo, you name it. things might just disappear. And before we meet the last of it, we need to salvage it. And this is applied to language, to antiquities. Think of what Scott, jackdaws into Abbotsford. It's all a huge, big salvage operation. From that salvage operation, we get the inspiration that newly produced culture could take its inspiration from the old heirlooms that we have brought into our possession. For me, I think I see a very important link between the rise of the historical novel and the philological text edition. So many historical novels begin with the conceit of the manuscript found in an attic. And so many historical novelists pretend, I think the monastery does it a little bit, pretend that they are basically philologists doing a Beowulf edition or, a Lay of the Last Minstrel type of stuff. So, or even the Sir Tristram, the Thomas the Rhymer thing that Scott does. So, then you start, channeling that, and you make your new text edition. Say, I found a manuscript found in an attic, and it was on a dark and stormy night that young Quentin Durward went to Liège, something like that. You get history paintings, you get neo-Gothic architecture. We begin to salvage old buildings rather than just tear them down as the 18th century would have done. And then we start building new ones, railway stations, temples of modernity, civic halls, university buildings, or the modern buildings of the 19th century, fountains in Kelvin Grove Park try to look like medieval cathedrals. You get the cult of Scottish baronial. Everywhere you get the cult of reproducing the past by new means. And finally, this is used in a propagandistic way to proclaim your identity. We get festivals, we get Highland Games, we get manifestation. The mode is another one. People begin to proclaim the presence of their culture in the public sphere. I think here in Bohemia, in the Czech lands, there's a very interesting thing of the choral societies, the Glachol, and the so-called athletic clubs with their sleds, their athletic manifestations. These become, the 19th century is also the century of the mass demonstration. It's not just the century of the imagined community, but as Anne Rigney has pointed out, it's also the century of the embodied community. The stuff that begins with Daniel O'Connell's mass rallies in Ireland and that will lead to Martin Luther King's marches for civil rights in the southern states. So bring people out in the streets and assert your presence. And in the 19th century, very often the funerals of writers, of composers, are manifestations to proclaim the identity of the nation. And this is the most intense form of the cultivation of culture. So that gives you a sense of how I'm trying to map all these things. And if you start looking at how this works out, this was a program, and I got a lot of money for it from the Dutch authorities, bless them. That's the encyclopedia that Murray talks about. It's an expensive book. The second edition out this summer will be a lot cheaper, but you can get it for free as well, because it's on the web and it's open source. And the abbreviation of Encyclopedia of Romantic Nationalism in Europe is ERNI, so that should be easy to remember. And if you go to erni.uva.nl, you'll see a lot of stuff brought together from Reykjavik to Baku and from Seville to St. Petersburg to see how everywhere in Europe people were beginning to cultivate their culture. And it wasn't just everyone doing it in their own bailiwick, in their own country. These people were international. And one of the most international of the lot of them was Walter Scott. Getting access to the Boslit digital repository of the Walter Scott correspondence was an eye-opener. The corpus there shows that, like the Brothers Grimm, he is like a radio control tower on an air. Wrong metaphor in these circumstances, but the lines crisscross all over Europe, and the fact that he was doing it from Edinburgh was no problem in sort of tracing the cultural connections and the correspondences. And what you then see is that Scotland is a full participant in the 19th century in this romantic nationalism, this self-proclamation of the nation as a culturally distinct entity and therefore deserving of autonomy. So some of the things I've been already indicating, here's the paddle steamer is on Loch Katrine. I think it's called the Jeannie Deans, is it? That's mixing two novels, actually. So we have, a the Heart of Midlothian and the setting of The Lady of the Lake and Rob Roy mashed up in a modern paddle steamer. So it's the counterpart to the fountain in Glasgow. This is where the water begins and where they bring tourists to the Highlands. And of course, the impact of what we would now call kitsch, right? 19th century is kitsch, but I think it's very meaningful, and it's something that deserves better than to be, dismissed in a snooty voice as saying, yeah, well, we've grown beyond that now. We have a cultivation of culture that is all over Europe, and here are some examples from Russia, from Sweden, from Andalusia, with Roma or Gypsy culture meeting Spanish bullfighters in an Orientalist Moorish setting of the Alhambra, and Kolokotronis being sworn into the Philikieteria, the Greek insurrectionary movement. So folk music, history, literary heritage, dress, landscape, traditions, all these are modes of proclaiming how cultures are national, distinct, and authentic. There is a paradox at work here. Every nation is saying, we're unique, we're so different from all the rest. And they all say it in the same way. So the paradox of universal exceptionalism is every nation thinks it's special, but there's nothing special about thinking that you're special. That's what everybody thinks anyway. So what the Scots think about themselves is very similar to what the Czechs think about themselves, and what the Finns think about themselves, and what the Serbs think about themselves. And you see the parallels once you start doing the comparative work. And I use, I'm if you like, a 21st century post-national cosmopolitan, and I say, tee, debunked, invention of traditions. But no, that would be unfair. This is, in fact, a deeply meaningful thing, because once you realize this, and you don't use it just as a smug way of mocking what these people were sacrificing their lives for, you say, what we have here in this universal exceptionalism is something very interesting. We have a tertium comparationis. We have something that allows us to compare the Scots with the Czechs, with the Finns, with the Serbs, with the Greeks. And we can actually, rather than locking each country in its own imperial frame, how the Scots were dealing with the United Kingdom and the Empire, and how the Czechs were dealing with the Habsburg state, and how the Finns were dealing with the Romanov Tsar state, and how the Greeks were dealing with the Ottoman Empire, you can actually say they were not compartmentalized, each in their own different prison house of nations, as Lenin phrased it, but they were doing similar things. And in fact, we saw that map. They were exchanging stuff. They were universalizing their particular concerns. So there's something deeply powerful in the universality of this exceptionalism. So what we can do now with the help of the encyclopedic gathering of materials is that we can compare European patterns. And we can see that rather than each individual case being caught up in a center-periphery structure, London vis-a-vis Scotland, St. Petersburg vis-a-vis Finland, you can actually draw the lines between Edinburgh and Prague and bypass the imperial centers. So this is, with a fancy word, a rhizomatic structure. It's like the root system of mushrooms, right? It's all a big entangled web. And it allows us to see how all the mushrooms are in fact one organism. So we're looking at the mycelium, and it's multipolar. And we can bring into focus interperipheral exchanges. And if you map that onto the physical map, you get a very interesting pattern. The Scottish peculiarities that I've checked earlier on, in fact, all have their analogies in the rest of Europe. So, the tradition of dance, as it moves from the Highlands into the drawing rooms of Edinburgh, have their parallel in Spain with the jota and the flamenco, in Bohemia with the polka, in Hungary with the czardas, in Romania with the hora. And so the various forms of national dress, it's interesting to compare a kilt with a dirndl. They have a similar trajectory in being adopted by the middle classes as a sign of belonging to a nation. National dress in the Baltic, in the Ukraine, indeed in Spain, all these things are a European pattern. The wild landscape harboring lawless pre-modern lifestyles and the setting for adventures, something that will take us in a way from Rob Roy to the the chase and adventure stories of John Buchan, have their strong parallel in Mediterranean and Southeastern Europe. Banditti in Corsica, in Sicily, and in Andalusia, haiduks and klefts hiding out in the mountains in Southeast Europe, in Greece and in Serbia and Bulgaria, are all of them Rob Roy's. The native elite autonomously exercising social cultural patronage over vernacular culture. We see that in Bohemia, in Poland, in Hungary, where we have native aristocracies looking for their, if you like, their feudal rights under the imperial crown and buying into a patriotism that comes underway in the early 19th century, for instance, establishing national museums, important thing in Prague and in Budapest. And in Finland, it's the Swedish-speaking elite that begin to patronize the Finnish language, which until then was an uncouth, boorish patois. Native institutions of learning. I think you can by now fill in, the dots. And an active participant in imperial modernity, Basque Country and Catalonia, and certainly Catalan participation in the colonial expansion of Spain in North Africa in the late 19th century. Something that Catalans don't like to be reminded of nowadays, but they were much more involved in, Spanish modernity in the late 19th century. So we see the parallels, but Scotland is still a little bit special because Scotland ticks all the boxes. And I can't think of any other country that does all of them one to last. So this is the map you get. This is vastly simplified, and it's basic. This is and you needed to be told that, right? This is a keynote. All I can do is give you peripheral vision and something to kick against. Basically being what Richard Nixon was for liberal America. But I did notice something to this effect, that most of the poetics of exceptionalism, of doing things differently, of not following the plain vanilla stream of cultural modernization from the Enlightenment into Romanticism, but giving an irritant, an alternative Europe, an other type of Europe, an exotic Europe, it is done in the European periphery, which is more or less contiguous from Andalusia to Albania, if you like. And if you want to have a litmus test of how we see that, well, in all these areas, you have vendettas. So you have private families doing warfare and conducting private violence over generations. So it goes from Andalusia to Albania by way of the Godfather, who exported it to America with a cult of respect and ultra violence if the head of the family is disrespected. And that seems to be all in the margins of the post-Enlightenment metropolitan Europe. But on the other side, there's Scotland. And this for me was the great thought experiment in coming to Prague, is to see how, in fact, culturally, in this rhizomatic non-center periphery structure, Scotland connects with the other peripheries of Europe, and how we, in fact, can make a meaningful constellation of that. It also seems to suggest very strongly, this is a little bit a sort of a Russian formalist way of looking at literary history, that innovation comes from the periphery. This the standard thing that the center of a literary system is canonical, and that's where they follow conventions. And it's from the fringes and from the edges that innovation comes in. Well, if you like, Romantic nationalism in Europe and the idea of the nation state was all anti-imperial. I would also like to suggest, and this is maybe where it's not quite as trivial, that all of this, I'll be coming back to that in the conclusion to my talk, means that we have a different thing here in resisting empire than we have in non-European national movements. In that These areas are not colonies. And nowadays we tend to look at the exoticism of Byron's Albania and Ali Pasha, or the exoticism of Carmen in Andalusia as a form of Orientalism. As I said before, there are common patterns, the hegemony of who is looking at whom. But on the other hand, these are not colonies. These are sub-imperial peripheries. And they have their own sub-imperial metropolies. Seville, Prague, Riga, Edinburgh, Dublin are not like the Haiti of Toussaint Louverture. They're not like the Vietnam of Ho Chi Minh. So there is a different position for these native elites cultivating their culture than what you have for proper anti-colonial nationalists in Asia, in Africa, and with, I suppose, British India as a sort of an in-between situation, because there you did have a native intellectual elite. But the complete robbing of the autonomous voice is not an issue inside Europe. So the subaltern groups here are still within a European comfort zone. And so we have an intermediary thing between the global and the national. Okay, so that as a sort of a comment by the side. I'd like to give you, I'm going to be very brief on this, a couple of examples. Tomorrow you'll be in a position to hear Adam Kozachka's article, presentation on Scott and Fenimore Cooper. But here's a good example of how you get these multipolar exchanges. The lawlessness of Rob Roy, the idea that Scotland is in a way a wilderness without law, order, and where only violence and warrior prowess will carry you through, is picked up by Fenimore Cooper in North America. And that in itself is interesting. But Fenimore Cooper becomes an inspiration for the urban wilderness that is traced by Eugène Sue in Les Mystères de Paris, who even speaks of les Apaches de Paris, the Apaches of Paris, who are like the savages of Fenimore Cooper in stalking each other and treating this, the city like a jungle or a prairie. And the whole urban social realistic novel of crime and violence will be followed through by Les Misérables, inspiring a lot of European spin-offs and also inspiring the type of action fiction, which will come back to Scotland with John Buchan, who of course sends his hero also to Constantinople and to places further afield. But a lot of scenes are set in the Highlands, where Rob Roy roamed more than a century before. Is there a structure to those entanglements, or is it just like a plate of spaghetti? Well, I'm going to very briefly try and point out that you can even, on a timeline, structure something. And this is going to take giant steps in order, with an eye on the time. We can see that the poetics of exceptionalism, the poetics of being different, of not following the conformist standards of culture, begins as soon as the poetics of the standard culture emerge in the Renaissance. When we get a classical standard, we get an anti-classical deviation from it, and that is the rediscovery of the Germanic tribes. Tacitus's Germania is printed for the first time in 1455, and Tacitus celebrates the action heroes living in the dank forests of Germany, who were capable of destroying 2 legions in the Teutoburg forest. This was Rome's Viet Cong moment. Whoops, we went across the Rhine to civilize the barbarians and we got our ass whooped. What happened? And Tacitus says, well, maybe we are a little bit too decadent for our own good, going to bathhouses and having orgies all the time, whereas these people living frugally in primitive circumstances are much more stalwart and manly. Virtus, of course, is a very virile thing. It's a masculine trait for the Romans. The ethnotype of Northern Europe being brawny and freedom-loving becomes very important there. And Tacitus also says the poets have a specific role. They have something called a baritus or a barditus. The manuscripts are very difficult to reconcile here. And this is how the poets incite their warriors into battle. And this is the beginning of the notion of the bard. Now, bards and bandits is really what I want to take as a guiding line through the plate of spaghetti. It's picked up in the 18th century discovery of the Celtic world, initially not very specifically distinguished from the Germanic world, both of them being North European. The bard there also takes an important role, but they are more in the sublime mode, because the sublime is a new 18th century form of aesthetics, and that is where the Celts come in, as opposed to the Germans, who are much more early modern. It's interesting how Ossian is both a bard and a druid, and he's usually shown in the gowns either of an Old Testament prophet, like Jeremiah or Isaiah, or maybe a Roman senator. So it's not very Celtic at all, because if you look at a real Celtic bard, such as in Joseph Cooper Walker's, he wears obelix trousers. The Celts wore pants. They didn't wear skirts. They were men in trousers. But as a bard, that doesn't really look right. This is authentic, but we want our bards to be dressed like John the Baptist or like Old Testament prophets. I'm owing part of this to Ron Houghton's fantastic book on the topic. Ever since, men in a bardic situation have something of the prophet, something of the wizard about them, and this has become the standard uniform for bards, druids, and wizards. From Gandalf to Dumbledore to Getafix, he's called in English, or Panoramix, the druid in the Asterix comics. And to the left is Merlin in a BBC production. The notion of the Ossian was the first modern bard. And of course, the scandal around Macpherson made the position fall vacant. The notion of the bard will be hijacked by the English in the 1820s, when bardolatry starts, and the Bard of Avon becomes William Shakespeare as the man who articulated English identity. But while the position was vacant, Byron wrote his English Bards and Scotch Reviewers in 1809, and he says, "Who now are the bards? We only have these scribbling, second-rate, versifiers like Wordsworth and Southey and, all the rest of them, and they claim to be bards." So it's a satire on his contemporaries. What happened to Milton, Dryden, Pope? Now we have Walter Scott. And he said, "The lay of the minstrel, may it be the last." So the notion of the last is already recognized by Byron for what it was. But in fact, Scott is the man who goes furthest to claiming the notion of bardicity. And I think he does so fairly deliberately. He uses words like minstrel, the way in Southern Europe they use troubadour, but he's picking up on something that comes in with the discovery of the Slavic world, the idea of the performative bard, somebody who is actually reconciling orality and literacy, who is always surrounded by an audience, who is in an immediate face-to-face embodied community, which is how Tacitus describes the bards, rather than working through print culture. And this, for Scott, is a massive inspiration. We heard Anna give a very interesting paper on that. And my favorite icon is this illustration of Flora MacIver in Waverley, where she takes Waverley over a very difficult path to a waterfall with her little harp, and then starts singing a poem by Rory Dahl, one of the last bards of the Highlands. There's a bard coming back to you. Ossian is ingested through Flora into the fabric of Waverley. Romance is at the heart of this novel. And in fact, Scott, in a typical paratextual play, something we heard Mirka, I think her name was, talk about this morning as well. Scott says, "Yeah, I know, people have written," this is an added footnote later on, "people have written to me and saying, this is a bit of a set piece, you went overboard there, Walter." It was Maria Edgeworth, actually, who rapped him over the knuckles. "But you have to know," says Scott, "Flora was educated in Paris. She's French and she wanted to make a sort of it." So he's actually blaming his own, contrivances on the artificial attempts to charm that he has endowed his heroine with. So very interesting Mobius strip between the narrator and the characters that he contrives. But the bard now becomes somebody who channels national tradition, and more often than not, national tradition, as we see in the Serbian bard later, I'll leave that, is disaffected, subversive, and is living outside the law. The bard becomes an outlawed figure, or at least the spokesperson for outlawed figures. The Byronic poems celebrating the Giaour, the Corsair, vendetta characters and the Orientalist exoticism of a modern bourgeois state claiming a monopoly on violence. We want law and order after Napoleon, but there are these stragglers who still live in an old age, like Rob Roy, who take the law into their own hands and who live outside the law. A Scotsman from Kelso, Henry Maine, was one of the most important people to phrase the contrast between law and lawlessness as a difference between modernity and tradition. Ancient Law by Henry Maine came out in 1861. And he phrased something which was later picked up by Max Weber, namely that the modern state develops a monopoly on legitimate violence. In pre-modern states, anybody can wage war, anybody can use violence to assert his or her status, but in modern states, you can't do that anymore. Ancient societies like ancient Rome were static because they were based on status. Very interesting insight by Maine. And sure enough, Maine is immediately co-opted into the imperial frame, sent to India to help draft the law code for imperial India. Gets knighted as a result of his labors. And a typical example of how the British Empire will bring its two extreme peripheries together, like Whitley Stokes in Ireland, Henry Maine in Scotland, are used in order to bring the more archaic, exotic parts of the empire, like Brahminic India, into the imperial frame. Scott himself was deeply interested in the struggle between personal honor and modern monopolies on violence. He translated Goethe's Guts von Berlichingen, which is famously one of the men who was still pursuing private war. He himself applied the formula in Rob Roy. Archaic society is based on honor or status, as Maine would call it, is predicated on the idea of nobility, individual prowess, and unmonopolized violence, whereas the modern state is all about virtue, civic virtue in particular, about social responsibilities. Think of all the Baileys and all the, you know, the officials in Scott's novels living in cities and towns, and a Weberian state monopoly on violence. One of the most interesting texts by Scott thematizing this is a translation from Southeast Europe. So this is where we really get a connection between the extremes of Europe. And Andre, I think we talked about it before, so it's in honor of your original invitation. I briefly checked this. Scott, in 1799, gives a manuscript to Ballantyne, the publisher, with a translation from the Morlachian language. That's a form of Serbo-Croat spoken in the Dalmatian coastlands. The Lamentations of the Faithful Wife of Hassan Aga. What yonder glimmers white on the mountain? And it's about a blood and guts revenge tragedy of a woman disowned by her husband in Ottoman-dominated Muslim Southeast Europe. Scott never published this. He probably never published this because another advocate, another Scottish lawman, John Boyd Greenshields, did an Orientalist collection in 1800 in which he did an alternative version, which in fact is better than Scott's own. So Scott kept it in manuscript. And it was only retrieved from his manuscripts in the 1920s, and it's only been in print for less than 100 years now. But it's an extremely interesting notion, this text, which has been going all around Europe. The first version was published in 1774, based on the Dalmatian-Croatian border, lamenting the tragic fate of a wife harshly banished by her husband. And it's in a traditional performative 10-syllable meter, so typically that oral performative sing-song type of thing. And this is a sort of a translation of the original. It begins with, what do I see in the mountains there? It's the tent of Hassan Aga, the warlord. The man who first printed it was a Venetian priest who undertook a voyage to Dalmatia. And there he noted it down. And he noted it down in parallel forms in Croat and in his own Italian translation. And it became, it came out in English, and it was dedicated to the Earl of Bute. This is what makes us go, it was immediately translated into French and into German. It influences Goethe. Goethe's poetic version was printed by Herder, and this is in fact what Scott translated. He did Guts von Berlichingen first, and then he did Goethe's translation of Hassan Aga. So you get this little thing, imagine the map of Europe under this trajectory, moving from Southeast Europe all the way to Herder in Riga at the time, and actually telling Europe that there's a different type of literature going on, which is non-print, which is performative, which is embedded in communities. And you realize that Fortis was deep in dialogue with Scottish and British intellectuals under the patronage of Lord Bute for his mineralogical interests, going to Dalmatia with a friend who at the time was Regius Professor of History in Cambridge, and in fact aware of the Ossianic intertext of this tune, because he said, I heard from my friend Cesarotti that this is interesting. And Cesarotti was famous for two things. He had translated Ossian into Italian, and he had translated Homer. And he, if more than anyone else, was responsible for the idea of Ossian as the Northern Homer. And Cesarotti, a pupil of Giambattista Vico, basically said, we have these, ancient epic poets like Ossian and Homer at the root of each national literature. So this is the plate of spaghetti that we see shape and how it connects the Balkans with Ossian. And with, as an intermediary, Vico, Cesarotti, and Herder. So you have to look for the diffuse trails, but this is how these rhizomatic things take place. There's an Irish thing there as well. It goes to Pushkin. And if I talk about the plate of spaghetti, you actually see it take shape on the map of Europe here. Okay, so my tentative conclusion is this. There's a special role for sub-imperial peripheries in the articulation of culture in 19th century Europe. They are special and non-colonial because they have a native aristocracy inheriting pre-modern power relations, and they have access to economic and intellectual modernization. So they are not in the position of real extra-European colonies. And there is a special role for sub-metropolitan centers, capitals like Prague, Glasgow, Dublin, Barcelona, Riga, and Helsinki. And we see that pattern still in the flourishing of arts and crafts and, Jugendstil nationalism, Art Nouveau nationalism in the years around 1900. So that is what I had to tell you about how the Dark Isle links up with the rest of Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I hope you have time for some questions. I'm sure there are people raring to go, and I think Martin has the first question.
Yes, well, I will be speaking without the mic. First, great, many thanks to for this.
Behind you, Martin.
Okay. And, I really appreciated your very positive account of romantic nationalism. But of course, there are also negative aspects. And what I have in mind is the discourse of organism, of the imaginary of nation as a single collective body, which is ethnocentric and exclusive. How would you accommodate this into your fantastic?
Thank you very, very much for that, Martin. Partly I went, I bent over backwards to be kind to romantic nationalism because I had Murray sitting next to me. But you're very right. There is an exclusivist, nativist, monocultural idea under the idea that each nation has one culture and every state should therefore be the embodiment of one nation. And that is an ideal of a state without minorities. It's not healthy. So the self-determination of peoples is perfectly all right as a democratic anti-imperial agenda. But what we see after the Paris Peace Treaties of 1919 is we get all these countries finally getting their freedom. And within 10 years, we don't have to wait for Hitler or for Molotov-Ribbentrop pacts. We see that in the Baltics, in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, in Greece, they all abolish parliamentary rule and install strongman leaders. And we get an illiberal form of nation states, which is an uncanny prefiguration of what we have now. So the idea that the nation state is the only show in town, it has proved its vulnerability as a model in the 1920s with the Pilsudskis, the Horthys, the Metaxas, and all the, the authoritarian strongmen who were installed. And that is, of course, and you're very right to say we should warn against the monocultural and nativist implications of it. That being said, to be even-handed and to also watch my back here, there are a few countries where this did not take place. And they stand out as shining examples. And they were, most importantly, Ireland and Czechoslovakia. Ireland had a brutal civil war in the 1920s. And when the victorious party lost the elections 10 years later, they handed over power to their opponents. Every other country, new sovereign country, was installing authoritarian rule. There was a peaceful transition of power in Ireland. It's one of the great unsung things. Masaryk and Czechoslovakia is a shining example of a new state that stays true. Maybe not. Maybe you can puncture this balloon. Okay, fair enough. But there are still, at this moment, some left-wing national movements in Europe. And they're concentrated in those areas that developed an industry in this period and had a strong labor movement. And that's the Basque Country and Scotland and Catalonia, where you can have a nationalism that continues the 19th century, but at the same time is of the left rather than the right. But it's difficult. Okay.
Right. What to unpack there? Who's next? Chris, I think, and then Carla.
I really enjoyed your wide-ranging and profound exposition of automatic nationalism, and I wanted to have just a couple of footnotes. The first one is around what you've just been saying. The American poet James Merrill, the lovely quote, I don't have it here, but he says that I love nations, but I'm even more fascinated by the topics of difference within the nation. And I think it's possible to make another narrative of developing national cultures, which is a dynamic between.
I'm going to come to you. My hearing is not great, so I want to hear properly.
A narrative of the development of national culture, which is a dynamic between a small group who are different and don't tick boxes, and this goes larger group who are uniform. In Scotland in 1928, there's a text by Peculiarities, where he talks about how crucial the Anglo-Irish dependency was in the Irish Protestant movement at the end of the 19th century. So Yeats, John Middleton Synge, Lady Augusta Gregory, and we found with a clause which is very unusual in Scotland at the same time, says that the Irish immigration now arriving in Scotland has the same role to act as the Catholics. And I think in Scotland you can make an argument saying that Scottish independence became feasible and the Nationalist Party moved centre stage in the 1990s, but the ex-Irish community stopped voting massively for Scottish Labour and stopped negotiating for the National Party. So then again, this smaller group of different people who are pivotal role in development. And the other point I wanted to make, I've been at the Multiverse for 16 years now. Bob, the composer, of a lovely essay of melodies in the basin. And he said, what happens is that melodies move freely between groups speaking different languages, but when they cross, they're sung to different words. And the words bring about the change in the melody, which then passes back in a different form to the original group. And to me, that connects to a statement by Pasolini, the Italian poet, which is also called and I don't know if right is wrong. Pasolini says, peasant culture of this nature is international. It recognizes no national politics. So the paradox would be then that the middle class people creating national culture in the 19th century saw as a absolute repository of their unique authenticity, something that isn't national at all, but it's international. That would be a problem for me. But it's a fascinating question, and I don't get an answer to it.
Will not. It is a fascinating question. Let me get back to the microphone. And you are totally right in pointing out the nuances and the shades of gray behind the very broad brush generalizing thing I did. The hybridities and the transnational, popular and informal forms of cultural exchange. You see that in many countries. You mentioned Anglo-Irish, you mentioned migrants. There's the situation of the Baltic Germans. And the notion of cultural transfers and cultural hybridization is a massive, if you like, it's a sauce on the plate of spaghetti. I've only looked at the pasta, and that's very, and you're dead right to point it out. And what we do see is, in fact, a type of internal colonialism whereby the middle classes co-opt the peasantry as the people they speak for, the people who must be represented. We get Maud Gonne saying that she will speak up for the Irish peasants, as if they couldn't do it for themselves. We get Jacob Grimm taking a completely transnational repertoire of fairy tales and turning it into something uniquely German and channeling the ancient Germanic mythology of dwarves and elves and dragons. And Bartok, you know, beginning as a national composer in the Smetana and Janacek mode, gets out of that national groove by realizing that he is looking at patterns that are not nationally compartmentalized. And it is possible then to spot that. But that's where you become modern rather than romantic. And I think this is possibly also the response of modernity, that insight to a 19th century type of cultural nostalgia. So point very much taken. Thank you very much.
Carla.
Very short, and I don't need to say that the 19th century nationals were independent in something wrong. Because it's not an parallel. So I'm really recommending this company. Seeing Janacek as a good year, as a bad year, not. There's a parallel.
There's a lovely documentary by a Bulgarian woman called Whose Is That Song? It traces a melody from Istanbul all over the Balkans. Everybody sings their own words to the same melody. Everybody says, this is our national song. It's a perfect illustration of the point you're making.
Carla. Microphone, we're there. Yeah, it's fine. I'll absolutely just to give it. Carla first and then.
My turn? Yes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks for the fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. It made lots of notes. Incidentally, I'm from Community. We're not far from Dalmatia, so I'll certainly look for this on the fathers and what he has to say about Dalmatia, this region. Now, you seem to use two categories, like colonial and non-colonial, which seems sort of black and white. And I wonder how useful it is to do that. Obviously, no one wants to compare the plight of African slaves in the Caribbean with Scots or with Catalonians and so on and so forth. But nationalism is also about empires, and not all empires, not all European empires expanded across the world. Many of them obviously expanded in Europe. And incidentally, I was thinking while we were talking that the word slave comes from Slav, and it was coined in Venice, which was a very big and aggressive empire, and there is no evidence that they were particularly nice to the people who colonized, including Mary. So again, is it not to mention the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire, which apparently is in the war. You know, how useful is it to choose two categories which are incompatible, and rather should we as historians map out and chart all the different shades of nationalism and colonialism? Because a lot of it obviously has happened in Europe, within Europe, and we had to account for it. And this was that's it. Yeah, you seem to imply that colonies, I mean, another example, you know, Ireland being a colony and Scotland not being a colony, and understood it. Irish, there was a sentence here, the Irish were involved in the British Empire, go to Jamaica, there's Irish town, and there's no evidence that you got the question, right?
Go back to the microphone. This is, thanks very much. You're picking precisely on the point I was trying to make. I was here perhaps in conversation with people in history who are very much looking at nationalism and nation building at a global level. I'm thinking of the London School of Economics and other places, and who look at loss of empire and the end of empire as a sort of a global mover for the rise of nation states. And they see that as something that happens from Indonesia to Mexico. And my problem is precisely that they will say Europe follows a pattern that is comparable to the colonies outside Europe. And because I didn't like the universalization of loss of empire being equated with decolonization, I wanted to find a middle ground where it's neither one nor the other, and to complicate the categories, which you rightly say are unhelpful. The other unhelpful thing is a black and white use of a one-size-fits-all generalized Saidian Orientalism, where as soon as you have a form of cultural hegemony or an asymmetry between somebody who's looking and somebody who's being looked at, we say, aha, Orientalism. And of course, Said, that was a core part of Said's analysis, but much as every poodle is a dog, not every dog is a poodle. So I want to say there are forms of cultural hegemony and representation which are asymmetrical and where there are imbalances at work, but it's not necessarily in the mode that Said denounces as being Orientalist. So I hope I was doing precisely what you are suggesting I should do, and I fully agree with your reservations on those things.
Question at the back now.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to ask in how authenticity works with your model. So you talked about independence and the imaginary communities created something, and you also mentioned this kind of poetry. So how much does it matter if something might be fake, but it's still used for the national enterprise? Yes.
Thank you very much. Lovely question. One of the delights of being in Prague is that, well, I had been hoping to meet Dalibor Dobiaš, who has been doing fantastic work on the Bohemian manuscripts, the contrived medieval manuscripts that were found in the early 19th century, and which, I mean, you never know, was Ossian authentic or a fake? You know, the word is still out there. But there's no doubt about the fact that the Bohemian manuscripts are like a $3 bill. You know, they're the real article. And at the same time, you still see the statue of Slavoj and Zaboj up in Vyšehrad, and all the Libuše operas and channelings of Czech identity are so important, totally irrespective of the fact that historians now say, it's not authentic. Of course, these are myths. Now, in the 1980s, myth was used as by way of denunciation, and we were talking about the invention of tradition. And we had a rather smug, factualist, positivistic, historical Trevor Roper attitude, saying, you think you are authentic, but I know better than that. That is totally unfair. It is not helpful. And if you realize that the past was remodeled in the image of the present, you have to see what sort of poetic input was there, what desires, what strategies drove that process. And you're dealing with a highly important historical fact, namely myth as an operative presence in cultural production, where authenticity is not so much of a starter. Now, the great debates about authenticity already begin in the 19th century, but on the whole, the 19th century is more interested in the inspirational value than in the factual genuineness of the ancient stories that are being done. And a lot of people are deliberately in the shadow zone. They take oral epic, which is like fairy tales. How authentic is Little Red Riding Hood? How authentic are the Nibelungen? Did dragons really exist? So I would say that we need to get a nuanced notion of the contrived simulacrums of the past that are used to provide needs in the present, without taking the one-upmanship and the holier-than-thou of invention of tradition. It's a tradition of inventions, and it's every bit as creative in its own way as Walter Scott in doing fictions, under the fiction convention of, you know that you suspend your disbelief here. So it's a massively interesting thing, and it certainly keeps the attention focused. I think Ossian would have been forgotten if it hadn't been for the scandal. You know, it would have been just one of those Vortigern or one of those 18th century things. Yeah, okay. But now it's as a whiff of gunpowder around. So yeah, it's massively important. Thank you for pointing up the shadow zone between the fictional and the documented historical. And the 19th century Romanticism inhabits that transition zone.
Yes.
I'm thinking. Most of the years you talk about using legal systems that are all the last the administration. And I think the was that right? With the meaning of innovators. What does it mean when these new nation states or nationalisms automatically do something strange? They're not fulfilling the debt, right? They're making a state, but they're making a state on this materialism of debt and ending as something that cannot possibly hold.
It's almost like trying to make a terminal at the airport. Thanks very much for that question. Why did you sit all the way back? Yeah, well, you were probably, you can probably think along with me. You probably know some of the patterns that I'm going to talk about. But fascism is defined by being palingenetic. So you're going to, you know, back to the origin and reboot the system. So there is a deep sense in the fin de siècle of decadence and the need for a regeneration by going back to the core strengths, which, as Vico said, were sort of there in the Big Bang when nations were in their youth. I think Yeats is a good example, if I quote an Irishman. Yeats is a fin de siècle poet. He sees drooping sort of Swinburne, kinky sex weirdos all around him. He himself is a bit in that limp wrist mode as well, but huge dicky bows, etc. And he says, you know, we used to have Homer and Beowulf, and they were the roots of the tree. And then we got the trunk of the tree, that was the history plays of Shakespeare and the tragedies of Aeschylus. And now we are in the foliage of the little twigs of, you know, Shelley and the Greek anthology and disembodied, you know, mixed feelings and affects. And isn't this decadence? Are we not doomed to decline? And then Yeats says, no, I am Irish. I am still in the position that I'm going to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. So I'm an Aeschylus and a Shakespeare rather than a post-Shelley romantic. And there is a deep sense that this is what romantic nationalism does in the climate of decadence and degeneration. And you get a regenerative program, palingenetic, and it goes through physical strength, through discipline, and the paramilitary idea of the state. So that's the fault line right there. And that's why people like Yeats move from romanticism to fascism, like Ernst Jünger, and a lot of these people who become fascists out of a romantic beginning.
I'm not saying no to anything you're saying, but this, and then again, when you talk about the sort of the fascism, the great health culture, the Nazi, the bad smoking, all of this is about a body and attempting to keep something alive that must die, and based on the model of governance that even as a model, like, no, I'm going to do this, is something that must die.
I think they're in denial about this, or they say the individual will die, but the collective will live on. I think it's a very liberal thing to say that we must die. The fascists wouldn't have done that. Or if they die gloriously.
It's because my bones hurt.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's another question.
The microphone, I don't know if it's on though.
Uh,
I'm sorry.
Right, so we'll take two.
I work on ecology, and my main field is actually, I feel, provenance and Scottish literature. I work on modern images of Slavic literatures, and I'm just starting to look at Scottish images, sorry. I just wanted to ask for clarification on your example of the Asanaganitsa, how the connection was made through the network, because that's actually very low. So that's just to clarify for myself. Okay, I actually need to quick run that.
Okay, so for Hasanagitsa, it's a very interesting text, should be much better known. It's a double whammy. You get a sentimental 18th century reception trajectory. It's Goethe doing the German translation based on a Swiss-German prose translation. And Goethe is translated into a lot of languages. And this is the sentimental form of Hasanagitsa. 15 years later, you get Vuk Karadžić, the great folktale and folk song collector of Serbian Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Serbian Jakob Grimm. He does a seminal collection of oral epic in the Balkans. And he finds Hasanagitsa so important, he can't leave it out. So he puts it back into his collection. This is published in Vienna. Jakob Grimm reads it. Jakob Grimm learns Serbo-Croat for the purpose of being able to read Vuk Karadžić. This is how these people work. He is mad about it. He said, this is great. You know, this is like Homer before Homer learned how to write. This is a bit like the Barry Lord Singer of Tales thesis, already there. Grimm writes to Goethe. And Goethe, being the insufferable genius that he is, says, oh yeah, I remember translating that 30 years ago. You know, that's what he's doing all the time. He did everything 30 years before the rest of the world caught on to it. And Goethe knows a young woman who deserves to be named here. Her name was Therese Albertine Louise von Jakob. She's known by her initials as Talvi. Her father was in the Russian service. She was bilingual Russian-German, and she's the founder of Slavic studies. And she translates Vuk Karadžić into German, and then Hasanagitsa makes its second appearance in the 1820s as an epic national heroic thing. So you see it doing two things in two moments in Europe: sentimental in the 1770s, epic national heroic in the 1820s. It's a fascinating case.
Just one last question. If you don't know, well, I just like to, on behalf of us all, to thank you very, very much indeed for this extraordinary multiversal tour through the multiverse of Scotland and Europe. To say it's given me many thoughts, and one of them now, I mean, is how marked Andrew Lang's fairy story, explicitly global fairy story mythology was in terms of expanding national footprint rather than contracting it, as with the Grimm brothers. There are just so many paradoxes and oppositions in this. You've given us all tremendous food for thought. Now it's time for food, lunch. Thank you. Please let us all thank him very much one more time.
Thanks, Mary.
I just have a question regarding the attendance fee.
Yeah. Look, that was really great, but you know, Masaryk is more complicated. Here's that aspect of modern states, but also he returns to the mythology of the Slavs as a peaceful race. And this, if you read through the Czech question, I don't think it was translated into English or into Dutch, but Czech question is a kind of every